In the late summer of 1959, a new face appeared on American Bandstand, not Arlene Sullivan, whose fame was already known, but Arlene DiPietro of Drexel Hill, a teenager whose presence carried a quiet strength. With her short dark hair and an easy smile, she wasn't the flashiest dancer on the floor, yet she moved with a rhythm that felt genuine and unforced. To viewers across the country, she quickly became one of those familiar faces who gave the show its heart. At home, Arlene was the daughter of a welder and a bank teller, a girl who practiced her steps in the family living room and took her schoolwork seriously. But inside Studio B, she transformed into a dancer broadcast to millions. Fans remembered her not because she courted attention, but because she represented something real, an ordinary girl who made the extraordinary leap onto national television and held her own among the regulars. And still, there was a paradox. Though she left her mark in contests and on camera, Arlene never lived for the spotlight. She preferred her studies, her family, and eventually a life built away from television. How does a teenager, once celebrated on the nation's hottest teen show, choose such a different path? That is the journey we will follow, from Drexel Hill to bandstand fame, and then into the quiet, remarkable life that came after. Arlene DiPietro's story began in Drexel Hill, Pennsylvania, a suburban community just outside Philadelphia, where family life was steady and close-knit. Her father worked as a welder, her mother as a bank teller, and together they built a home that reflected the modest dreams of post-war America. Arlene had an older brother, Bob, who often doubled as both protector and companion. The DiPietro family was not wealthy or extraordinary, but it was loving, and that foundation would shape the choices Arlene later made. The 1950s were a time when the idea of the teenager as a cultural force was only beginning to emerge. Across the country, young people were breaking away from the expectations of their parents, listening to rock and roll, and finding their own voices in music, fashion, and dance. In Drexel Hill, Arlene lived in this cultural shift. The radio in the DiPietro home often carried the latest hits, and like so many of her peers, she practiced steps in front of the mirror, her worn shoes tracing patterns to the songs that defined a generation. Her character was different from some of the other regulars who would later become her peers. Arlene was studious, serious about her schoolwork, and never one to chase wild parties. She preferred structure, routine, and the company of her brother's college-aged friends who teased her affectionately and treated her like the kid sister of the group. Beneath that academic focus, though, was a quiet love for music and movement that was impossible to ignore. One of the most personal and defining moments came through her mother. After undergoing surgery, Mrs. DiPietro encouraged Arlene and her brother Bob to go down to American Bandstand so that she could see her children dancing on television while she recovered at home. It was an unusual but heartfelt request, a reminder of how much pride parents of the 1950s felt when their children appeared, even briefly, in the new medium of TV. That encouragement, born in a moment of vulnerability, became the spark that carried Arlene into the studio and, ultimately, onto the dance floor. The bond within the DiPietro family was steady and strong. While Arlene would soon become part of a televised phenomenon watched by millions, she always returned each day to Drexel Hill, where dinner at the family table and the ordinary rhythms of suburban life anchored her. That balance between the extraordinary stage of American Bandstand and the ordinary warmth of home would follow her throughout her journey. That ordinary childhood, shaped by family, faith, and quiet determination, was about to collide with something extraordinary: the bright lights and dizzying energy of Studio B in Philadelphia, where Arlene's life would change forever. For teenagers in Philadelphia, the doors of Studio B were like the gates to another world. Lines often stretched down the block, filled with eager boys in pressed shirts and girls in skirts that swayed with every step. In 1959, Arlene DiPietro found herself among them, standing quietly, not yet aware of how profoundly that afternoon would shape her life. She wasn't there to chase fame, only to experience the thrill of being near the music and the dancers she had seen on television. Inside the studio, the air buzzed with excitement. The cameras loomed overhead, their red lights blinking as technicians prepared for broadcast. The music was loud, the chatter constant, and the floor pulsed with the beat of rock and roll. For a moment, Arlene stayed near the sidelines, unsure if she belonged in the middle of it all. Then something happened that changed everything. Nick Gaeta, one of the established regulars, noticed her. With a welcoming grin, he reached out his hand and invited her to the dance floor. He introduced her to the others, making space for her in a circle that had once seemed so unreachable. The moment she stepped under the lights, Arlene felt her nerves give way to rhythm. The studio floor was alive beneath her feet, and though the cameras were intimidating, the music carried her forward. She moved with a natural confidence, her steps steady, her expression bright but calm. It was not the performance of someone desperate to be seen, but the genuine energy of a teenager who simply loved to dance. Back home in Drexel Hill, her mother, still recovering from surgery, watched the broadcast with pride. To see her daughter and son on television was more than entertainment. It was healing, a symbol that her family was whole and that her children had stepped into something remarkable. Neighbors talked about it, friends mentioned it at school, and suddenly Arlene was no longer just another girl in the crowd. She was a regular. That first dance on air was a blur, but its impact was lasting. She had crossed the invisible line between viewer and participant, from the living room to the studio floor, from anonymity to recognition. Within weeks, Arlene's face became one that fans associated with the magic of American Bandstand. And yet, this was only the beginning. Soon, contests would test her skill, partnerships would define her style, and the nation would come to know her not just as a girl who joined the dance, but as a dancer who left her mark. By 1960, Arlene DiPietro was no longer the quiet newcomer Nick Gaeta had welcomed onto the floor. She had become part of the bandstand fabric, a regular whose presence viewers came to expect each afternoon. She did not dominate the screen with theatrical gestures, but she had something subtler, a natural, steady rhythm that felt accessible and true. In a show filled with sparkle and charisma, Arlene stood out precisely because she never forced it. Her defining moment came in the Jitterbug Contest of 1960, set to Hank Ballard's lively hit, Finger Poppin' Time. Partnered with Billy Young, Arlene took to the floor with sharp footwork and controlled spins, moving with a precision that impressed both the audience in Studio B and those watching across the country. The contest was fast, demanding, and full of energy. While Barbara Levick and Billy Cook ultimately took first place, Arlene and Billy finished second, a remarkable achievement that etched her name into the collective memory of bandstand fans. For many, the sight of Arlene twirling with poise to the pounding rhythm remains one of the show's iconic images. But contests were only part of her story. Week after week, Arlene became a familiar face in the tapestry of teenagers that defined the program. She was often photographed alongside other regulars, Carmen Jimenez, Barbara Levick, Billy Cook, and Janet Hamill. And in those group shots, her calm, self-assured presence stood out. She didn't chase the spotlight, but her smile and steady demeanor gave her a quiet magnetism. Her style was equally distinctive. While some dancers embraced flashy outfits or hairstyles designed to catch the camera, Arlene kept her look simple and timeless. Her short dark hair framed her face neatly, her dresses were chosen more for movement than attention, and her dances emphasized clarity over flair. This simplicity became her strength. Viewers at home saw someone they could relate to, a girl who might live next door, yet who carried herself with grace on national television. In a time when fan clubs sprang up around the most popular dancers, Arlene received her share of attention. Letters arrived, sometimes gifts too, and she experienced the curious shift from anonymity to recognition. Teen magazines occasionally mentioned her name or printed her photograph, solidifying her place in the constellation of bandstand regulars. And yet, she never let it change her. Arlene remained grounded, mindful that her life extended beyond the studio walls. Her peak years on American Bandstand aligned with the height of the show's influence on American youth. Every weekday, millions tuned in, and Arlene's presence became part of a national ritual. Whether competing in contests, dancing casually with partners, or clapping along to the music, she helped create the atmosphere that kept fans coming back. Her smile and her style made her unforgettable. And soon, in partnerships with other dancers, from Billy Young to Nicky Fiorentino, she would demonstrate how chemistry on the floor could magnify the magic of bandstand. On American Bandstand, partnerships were everything. The chemistry between two dancers could transform a song into something unforgettable, and for Arlene DiPietro, those connections shaped the highlights of her time on the show. Her most celebrated pairing came with Billy Young, the partner who joined her in the Jitterbug Contest of 1960. Their second-place finish was not just a competition result. It was a performance that captured the spirit of bandstand itself, youthful, energetic, and alive with rhythm. Fans remembered how effortlessly they spun and kicked, their movements synchronized without being over-rehearsed, a reminder that the best bandstand moments always felt spontaneous. But Billy was not her only partner. Arlene often danced with Nicky Fiorentino, a regular known for his outgoing personality and strong stage presence. Together, they represented a different kind of balance, Nicky's bold flair matched by Arlene's steady grace. In 1961, they even competed in the Pony Contest, embracing the new dance craze sweeping through Philadelphia. Though their performance did not bring home a prize, it showcased Arlene's adaptability and her willingness to evolve with the shifting trends of teen culture. Behind the contests and cameras, life at Bandstand revealed another side of Arlene. Among her fellow regulars, she was part of a community that often felt like a second family. They shared laughter in the hallways, nervous anticipation before broadcasts, and inside jokes that never reached the television audience. One photograph from December 1960 captured Arlene and fellow dancer Frank Brancaccio holding Pat Molitieri's tiny dog. It was a candid moment. No spotlight, no contest, just teenagers enjoying one another's company. Images like this reminded fans that behind the polished broadcasts were real friendships and real lives. Arlene's personality also shaped her experience. She was not one to chase parties or bask in attention. Unlike some of her peers who embraced the dizzying pace of fan mail and social outings, Arlene preferred to keep her focus on school and family. She often gravitated toward the company of older college-aged boys, many of them friends of her brother Bob, rather than seeking the whirlwind romances that sometimes emerged among the regulars. This maturity set her apart and gave her an air of steadiness that resonated with those who got to know her. The pressures of the show were real. Popularity could shift quickly, comparisons between dancers were constant, and being featured in magazines or fan club newsletters added to the competition. Yet, Arlene managed it with quiet dignity. She didn't need to outshine her peers. Her strength lay in being herself, dancing with sincerity and composure. For viewers, these partnerships and glimpses behind the scenes cemented her place in the bandstand story. She could spin with Billy Young in a contest, adapt to the pony with Nicky Fiorentino, or laugh with Frank Brancaccio over a small dog. And each of those moments felt genuine. She wasn't a performer playing a role. She was a teenager living her youth in front of the cameras. But youth is fleeting, and even the brightest rhythms eventually shift. Behind every perfect dance was the truth that life outside the studio could not wait forever. Arlene, like so many of her fellow regulars, would soon have to decide whether to keep dancing for the cameras or follow a different path. By 1961, Arlene DiPietro had become a familiar presence on American Bandstand. For nearly 2 years, she had danced across the screen, joined contests, and shared the stage with some of the most recognizable regulars of her era. Yet, as the seasons changed, so too did Arlene's priorities. Behind the lights and applause, she was grappling with questions that every young person faces. What comes next? How long can one live inside a moment before stepping into the future? The first signs of change were practical. Arlene's commitment to her studies began to collide with the time demands of the show. Every weekday afternoon spent at Studio B meant afternoons not spent on homework, reading, or preparing for exams. For some regulars, the thrill of television was worth the sacrifice, but Arlene was different. She valued education, recognized its importance, and could not ignore the growing tension between schoolwork and dance rehearsals. Her personal life added to the turning tide. While others enjoyed parties and the social swirl that surrounded the bandstand circle, Arlene kept her distance. She preferred quieter evenings, the company of family, and the friendship of her brother's older peers. Even in relationships, she leaned toward stability rather than spectacle. For Arlene, bandstand was an experience to cherish, not a stage to build a life upon. Then came the emotional weight of decision. Walking away from bandstand was not easy. She had been part of a phenomenon, recognized by strangers, written about in magazines, and cheered on in contests. To leave meant letting go of an identity that millions of Americans associated with her. Yet she also knew that staying could trap her in a cycle that offered excitement without long-term direction. The question was not whether she loved dancing, she did, but whether she was willing to make it the defining feature of her life. When she chose to step away in 1961, it was with a mix of sadness and resolve. Friends in the regular circle felt her absence deeply. They had shared so many afternoons, inside jokes and nervous countdowns to live broadcasts. For viewers, her departure was a quiet disappearance. No grand farewell, just a face no longer seen among the crowd. But for Arlene, the decision brought relief. She was free to focus on her studies, to prepare for work, and to begin shaping a future grounded in more than television lights. Looking back, her choice reflected a maturity unusual for someone her age. Many young dancers would have clung to the fame for as long as possible. Arlene understood that fame, while intoxicating, was fleeting. She wanted something steady, something lasting, something that would carry her into adulthood with dignity. In leaving Bandstand, Arlene illustrated a truth that is often forgotten. Not every teenager on the show was chasing celebrity. Some were simply seizing a moment, living it fully, and then moving on. For Arlene, that moment had been sweet, but she was ready for what came next. Fame had faded, but a new life was waiting, and Arlene was prepared to embrace it with the same poise she once carried on the dance floor. Once Arlene DiPietro stepped away from American Bandstand, she did not disappear into obscurity. Instead, she redirected her energy into building a life rooted in stability and purpose. For someone who had been seen by millions as a teenager, her path forward was strikingly grounded. She returned to her studies with focus, determined to prepare herself for a future beyond the cameras. After earning her associate's degree, Arlene began working as a legal secretary, a role that required the same precision and composure she had displayed on the dance floor. Her work ethic and reliability carried her further, eventually leading her to a position with the vice president of the Philadelphia Stock Exchange. It was a career defined not by public recognition, but by responsibility and trust, qualities Arlene had long embodied. In those offices, far from the music and flashing lights of Studio B, she carved out a professional identity built on diligence and quiet strength. Her personal life carried equal weight. Arlene married, and for 32 years she built a home with her husband. Together, they raised 2 daughters, creating a family life filled with the ordinary joys that mattered more to her than any fleeting fame. To her children, she was not the dancer once glimpsed on television, but a devoted mother, someone who guided them through school days, family gatherings, and the countless small routines that shape a household. To friends and neighbors, she was remembered as steady and dependable, someone who could be counted on in both good times and hard. Life, however, is not static. When her first marriage ended, Arlene faced another turning point. Rather than retreat, she carried forward with resilience, a quality she had shown since her teenage years. In 2015, she remarried, this time finding companionship with Sue Peterman. For some who remembered her from Bandstand, this came as a surprise, but for Arlene, it was simply another expression of her authenticity, living life in a way that was true to herself. In her later years, she remained in the Philadelphia area, living a suburban life that was both ordinary and remarkable. Ordinary in that she shopped for groceries, cherished family dinners, and celebrated holidays like anyone else. Remarkable in that she had once been part of a cultural phenomenon still remembered decades later. Occasionally her name or face resurfaced in Bandstand retrospectives, and fans were struck by how gracefully she had bridged the gap between youthful fame and adult fulfillment. Her journey after Bandstand offered an important reminder. The dancers who filled America's screens were not frozen in time. They grew up, built careers, raised families, and lived lives that extended far beyond the studio floor. Arlene embodied that truth fully. She did not cling to what had been, but embraced what came next, shaping a life filled with work, family, and enduring love. She may have stepped away from television, but her presence never truly disappeared. It lived on in the memories of those who watched her dance, and in the legacy of the family and friendships she nurtured long after the cameras stopped rolling. Arlene DiPietro's time on American Bandstand was brief compared to some of her peers, yet her presence left a lasting impression. She was not the loudest nor the most spotlight-driven, but she danced with an honesty that resonated. Her second-place finish in the Jitterbug Contest of 1960, her easy grace alongside partners like Billy Young and Nicky Fiorentino, and her steady presence in group shots made her part of the fabric of the show's golden years. She reminded viewers that Bandstand wasn't only about stars, it was also about ordinary teenagers whose authenticity gave the program its soul. Her legacy, however, extends beyond those afternoons on television. Arlene chose to step away, to build a career, raise a family, and live authentically in later years. In doing so, she demonstrated that the true measure of a life is not the fame one holds on to, but the values one carries forward. For fans who remember her, she embodies the bittersweet beauty of youth, fleeting, unforgettable, and yet only one chapter in a much larger story. Were you among those who tuned in when Finger Poppin' Time filled the studio and Arlene twirled across the floor? Do you still recall the way she smiled, steady and unhurried, in a room alive with sound and light? Share your memories with us, the songs, the dances, the moments that still echo. And if these stories bring you back, join us here at American Bandstand Memories. Subscribe, and together we'll keep alive the dancers, the music, and the spirit of an era that never fades.